I will just say, I guess to start, it seemed like to me that, in his description of this idealist world, a lot of it our world could be interpreted along the lines of that world, given the, if you were to make the transformations that he suggests, like about, nouns and math and stuff, our world could be interpreted that way up until he got to that last bit about the, again, I don't know how to pronounce it, but the Renier, that seemed to violate the sort of, I don't know what, laws of reality, but maybe there's a way to reinterpret that also. But
that's because you haven't practiced magic before.
Oh, is that right? Okay.
Yeah. If you do occult rituals enough, you can create hyperstitions, you can create thought forms, egregores. All these things can seep into reality.
Okay.
I'm half joking, but I agree. I think what he's trying to do is kind of complicate the, what world is this? Is he talking about our world? I think ultimately what he's kind of trying to do is he's trying to complicate this separation of the fictional, imaginal world and the real world, whatever that is, and show how these seep into each other, and they seep into each other through a medium, through the interface, in this case of a text, but I think just about any medium you can kind of think of in the sense of media, or I think this is especially true with technology, media technologies, that you have these interfaces where these worlds can seep into each other, where you have this imaginal world of fiction and this rigor of ideas and whatnot that can cross over into each other, in the same way that these fictional worlds, they get some of their order, their rules from what is real. If you have a video game or something like that, you have to use some kind of a physics that resembles the real world's physics in order for it to work at all. So I think ultimately what he's trying to do is complicate this, but it's also a kind of metafictional reflection on the text itself, and also kind of his medium as, this is a short story that's fictional. And I think he starts that in like the very first page when he talks about, well, first of all, there's all these symbols of the mirrors, which I think we'll end up talking about a lot for this whole seminar. And so apparently Borges, he had a fear of mirrors from the time he was a kid. He was terrified of mirrors.
Same.
So, yeah. So at the very beginning, he's talking to this guy, his associate, and they were engaged in a vast polemic concerning the composition of a novel in the first person, whose narrator would omit or disfigure the facts and indulge in various contradictions, which would permit a few readers, very few readers, to perceive an atrocious or banal reality. I think he's being ironic there, where he's saying basically he's talking in a text, in a fiction, about a fiction that has this capacity to omit or disfigure facts and things like this. That's ultimately what it's about. So it's kind of the mirror reflecting itself again.
Yeah, that sentence there. I don't know how many of you. I don't know if any of you have seen the movie. I can't remember the name of it. Arrival.
Oh yeah,
Arrival, where that big thing comes down, and then the woman begins to figure out the language, and then she starts having these temporal shifts of perception. And the idea there seemed to be that through the medium of a language, she began to perceive reality in a different way. It wasn't like she wasn't perceiving, she didn't start perceiving things that weren't there. She just started perceiving her reality in a different way. And that's what that made me think of, because when I was reading some of these descriptions of mathematics and metaphysics and time and so on, you know, I started trying to put myself in the frame of my, or like the language, you know, when there are no nouns, there are just these exhaustive descriptions of things. And so everything's adjectives and adverbs and so on. And,
well, and those were even two different languages, right? Like it explicitly was like, this language is just all verbs, and then this language is just all adjectives.
But it reminded me more of dialects, that they seem to both be part of the same language, but for some reason it was a branch.
Gotcha. No, and that makes sense, right? Because there's definitely something very similar in terms of having an all verb versus all adjective language.
But what I was trying to do is imagine what would it be like, or I was trying to momentarily put myself in that way of trying to experience the world. I wasn't very successful, but I mean, I wonder if it's a little bit like Arrival, where, you know, we've talked about the way some people explicitly like Deleuze, and then some people, well, and then like Kierkegaard, where they try to, through the text, try to alter your awareness so you experience your life in a different kind of way. And I wonder if that's a bit of what he's trying to do here, is to sort of put our minds into or invite us to put our minds into a different way of experiencing the world around us.
So is this kind of, would this be related to the Sapir-Whorf Hypothesis? I think that's what it's called.
Yes.
I don't know that. You guys have talked about it. Why don't you? I don't remember it.
Yeah.
That's also the thing from Arrival, right? It's the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis is the explanation of why the language is able to make her be able to experience the past and the future as simultaneous.
Yeah, so it basically says that your language shapes your perception, essentially, of time and all kinds, how you would kind of differentiate objects, how you think of these objects. That basically your language shapes how you actually perceive reality.
Well, and experience it, right?
Yeah, and I think he points to that on, I think the pages are similar in the different editions, but on page 11 for me at least, when he talks about these the paradoxes.
Oh, oh God, what is it called? The heresy
basically of materialism, I guess. Yeah.
The 9 copper coins.
Yeah, and so he says basically
the 9 copper coins. Yeah.
So he gives this thing of, there's coins, and then the number changes. They must have had to have been there in some secret, hidden way beyond the comprehension of man. And he says that the language of Tlön resists the formulation of this paradox. Most people do not even understand it. So he says basically that the language is one of the reasons that these people couldn't even understand the concept of material objects that abide beyond human perception of them. So I think that definitely supports that he's kind of trying to draw this point that is, I think, so Borges, he's constantly trying to complicate reality. He's trying to show how all these things kind of manipulate our unproblematic understanding of it. So language in this case is just one of those things that you'll get, because he's full of them, full of these ways of trying to disrupt our sort of common sense, easy notions of understanding reality in a very clear sense. But then I think also what's important is there's like kind of like a question here. They have this idea of idealism as a what is real is what humans perceive or can think of. So then there's this question about human realities of humanism and things like that. And the paradox that they couldn't understand is that something could have existed in some secret way, hidden from the comprehension of men. And when he talks at the end about, Tlön will take over, and any kind of ideal system that's nice and neat and has a symmetry and a semblance of order, like dialectical materialism, anti-Semitism, Nazism, was sufficient to entrance the minds of men. So I think here he's obviously giving some kind of like a warning. And what he's saying, I think you can interpret this, at least I do, as there's a danger to thinking that the way that humans see reality is the only way. That once you totalize reality as what it is according to the human reality, however we want to think of that, that's where we get these dangers from this totalizing aspect. And I think a lot of what he's trying to do is he's trying to complicate that totalizing and give us a kind of a plurality, this kind of kaleidoscopic view of being able to look at multiple realities.
Well, can I jump on that?
Sure.
I can, to me, this is Borges starting with an idea and saying how far he can take it to its logical conclusion. But I agree with you to the extent of, to me, it's not so much how we experience it, but rather I think he's giving us a caution on totalistic systems, ideologies, theologies. You can read this as a caution against institutionalized religion, but you can also view it as an attack on some very long-lasting thought like Plato and Descartes, or even remember his reference to dialectical materialism. That's a fancy way of talking about Marxism. He's explicit about Nazism. You could also see this as his, remember, this was published in late 1940. Hitler, I'm sorry to say, in the summer of 1940, it's his greatest hits. I mean, he's just conquered Poland, Denmark, Norway, already annexed Austria, occupied the Low Countries, and defeated France. He's at the top of the world. Borges is in Argentina, which has an increasingly friendly government to the fascist Nazi ideal. So I see him also this as a caution against any totalizing, totalistic ideology similar to or being like Nazism and communism.
I think if I may, I think that well, you're correct. I in a lot of ways I agree with a lot of what you're saying. I think that the complicating of it that Chase was talking about, the Hroners, or whatever, the objects that are created by desire or whatever, the ideals being made real, right? And the kind of notion of Tlön in general as a place that exists within the minds of men, and thus it is kind of real in a way because it's in our minds, but either way, I think that the complicating with these objects, these like the compass and the metal triangle becoming real, I think at least in some way we come to not necessarily totally critique or like, just destroy or attempt to destroy Plato, right? It's kind of a reconciliation between the two in a way, and like a materialist Platonism in a way, which I've heard a lot of, like, I've heard that people talk about before. It's the idea of the contingent immediate material reality containing eternities and eternal concepts like our social being as totally contingent and but together with this it's co-substantial with this impulse for freedom, that's always been through human history or whatever. It's this this sort of Platonism that I think Borges is saying is there. It's present. It's a factor in our experience, in our material, real experience. There's this sort of universality within contingent reality, in a way, I think.
Well, maybe it's just because I'm living through the presidency of Donald Trump, but there is an impulse towards freedom, but there's also an impulse against it. I mean, Erich Fromm wrote, the classic book, Escape from Freedom. Laszlo wrote his book, World Politics and Personal Insecurity. Let me go to the paragraph that, I apologize, everybody has different page numbers, but it is just a few pages before the postscript that starts, this monism or extreme idealism completely invalidates science. To explain or to judge an event is to identify or unite it with another. In Tlön, such connection is a later stage in the mind of the observer, which can in no way affect or illuminate the earlier stage. Each state of mind is irreducible. The mere act of giving you the name falsifies it. From all this, it would be possible to deduce that there's no science in Tlön, let alone rational thought. The fact, I almost get a sense that try to explain to an extreme anti-Semite that they're wrong. In their mind's eye, in their anti-Semitic system, Jews control the media, Jews control the banks, Jews are behind capitalism, but at the same time, in a strange way, they're also a bunch of communists. It's very difficult to have a rational conversation with someone who believes in the protocols of the elders of Zion being a real historical document and not a forgery. And to me, this monism or extreme idealism, to me, is at the heart of what this short story is about. What is happening to people when they totally have in their mind any theology or philosophy or ideology that is the explanation for everything?
I see that too, like how he was almost warning against this subscription to a totalizing system that was created by man. Kind of going along with what Chase said, the reference to that one guy the rich guy who left all his stuff to the conspirators. And he said that just like there should be no pact with the imposter Jesus Christ. He almost had this kind of like spiteful want to demonstrate to this non-existent God that mortal man was capable of conceiving a world. And then going onward, like towards the end too, is where it seems like he's really getting into this idea of how the tendency for everybody to just so quickly subscribe to this system that makes everything so orderly. But he makes that distinction between he makes that comment about the divine laws, the inhuman laws, and about recognizing that there's like the way the world works is beyond man's capacity to kind of conceive it and put it into an orderly system. But nevertheless, we're confronted with these systems and these labyrinths that kind of have an influence on how we go about the world and interpret it. I guess, yeah, so that's kind of the blurry line is our systems aren't capturing it, but they're nevertheless like influencing how we relate to each other and how we're interpreting it and acting.
I suspect that Borges would actually say that contemporary scientific realism is also one of those systems that we blindly.
I think so too.
Yes.
Yeah.
So
totally.
Rather than saying idealism bad, materialism good. Welcome, Endymion. Hello.
Hey.
Yeah, along those lines, Dr. Reeser, in the introduction, I don't know if anybody read the introduction, but he makes a comment about Borges kind of having this like self-parodying tone and this like irony to his writing, and that like he'll take his own ideas and then like reach their and it's weird. He even said that in the book. He was referencing the idea in Tlön that a book that doesn't contain its own antithesis is incomplete. And I think that's what he's doing in his own book. He's having the two sides. Yeah, I just thought that was interesting. But it was also
that's a good point. I like that.
Yeah.
I didn't quite pick up on that, but I think almost everything, you know, he has this thing about these mirrors and these doublings, and he does that in his own fiction, where almost everything he talks about in his fiction is doubled, and it's very act of like writing and expression.
Yeah.
So he's doing that in the sense that, because I think kind of, you know, if you look at like, what is the underlying philosophy that he's talking about here? You know, with these inhuman laws, but then these human ideas that kind of take over and have this real effect on reality. It's almost like, you know, like speculative realism. There's this idea that, you know, the object kind of supersedes the qualities that we can actually experience. It can never be fully exhausted by any kind of human perception or idea of it. There's always something like a, you know, like a Kantian noumena that's beyond this. So he almost has an idea kind of like that, but then he recognizes that there's still this aspect, the phenomenal aspect, I guess. You know, I don't think this is Kantianism or anything like that, but there's this understanding though that still, even within that kind of what we can vaguely call like a speculative realism of inhuman laws, that there is still kind of like this antithesis present in it, where human laws still change these things. They still seduce reality. And he talks in here about, you know, the plasticity of reality. That reality was just waiting to bend to the will of Tlön and these imaginal worlds. And I think that's significant. It's kind of like there's a realism to it, but that realism has a kind of attenuated idealism.
Yeah,
and maybe even vice versa. So
yeah, on page 17, when he's talking about that, like reality yielding to the systems that are the artifacts that were being distributed. I was curious as to, like, he doesn't say like, you know, people yielded to these ideas. He uses the phrase reality yielded on more than one account, which I'm like wondering if that was intentional along the lines of kind of implying that, like, it's not just the people that are getting sucked in or duped by some trickery of a system, but it's like reality almost has this tendency to flow with the systems we're creating, whether or not they're.
I think I wonder if a lot of the stuff about this idealist world is actually just a parody of our materialist world, and if he's just taking our contemporary conventional materialist understanding of the physical world and just flipping it over. So, you know, when he says things like inhuman laws, that's the way we view physical laws, right? I mean, they're not human laws, they're physical laws. And that, you know, that sophism of the 9 copper coins, I wonder if that is a parody of the Eleactic paradoxes, like Zeno's paradox of motion. And so, you know, you can take, given our conventional assumptions about the way reality works, you know, it's a material world, blah, blah, blah. Then when you read, you know, like Zeno's paradoxes, you're like, man, shit, this doesn't even make sense. And it's just completely mind-bending. And, you know, you think there's got to be something wrong here. And then you read what, like this 9 copper coin thing, and you read under the italicized paragraph on page 11, his reasoning. The reasoning makes complete sense if you're working within this sort of idealist frame. I mean, it makes it, you know, this argument, the verbs find and lose beg the question because they presuppose the identity of the first and the last 9 coins. I mean, if you're working in an idealist framework, that's right. And so that's why I wonder if he's taking, you know, kind of in some ways, like Chase was saying, we have this dogmatic, you know, well, idealism has got to be nonsense. Obviously, we've known since after the middle 19th century that idealism is nonsense, and since the advent of analytic philosophy. And I think, you know, I wonder if part of what he's doing is going, it's kind of just depends on what axioms you take. And if you take a different set of axioms, you can interpret our reality in a very different way.
Yeah, if I could add to that, I'm glad you brought up the science aspect of this, Nevitt, because, and what you just said now has a lot of force, because for me, Borges, you talked about dogmatism. I really think that Borges is cautioning us against any dogmatism, the dogmatism of dialectical materialism, and you know the phrase scientism, a kind of almost religious belief in the scientific approach and scientific methodologies being the only way to acquire knowledge. And that's why I think that hidden in this is not only a critique of these totalizing ideological or religious systems, but also a critique of Descartes, where I stumbled over something recently that sickened me, but Descartes actually did medical experiments on living animals and said there was nothing wrong with it. And Descartes seems to be a very important early, for lack of a better term, philosopher of science. And when you think of the late 19th century, early 20th century, science leading to technology, industrialization, urbanization, literally creating a new world. And so I agree with you that to me it's a whole range of dogmatisms that Borges is warning us about if we follow any of them.
So can I jump in real quick?
Go for it.
So I guess a couple of things, because one thing is that we're thinking of so if we're running with this analogy of the Tlön being sort of a mere opposite of our world, where we're hardcore materialists and they're hardcore idealists. I think the complicating factor in that description is it seems like materialism has much less of an ideological hold on our world than idealism seems to have on the world of Tlön. Right? Like if he's specifically talking about something, for instance, like Nazi ideology, well, a lot of like fascist ideologies seem to have a certain kind of intrinsic idealism to them, insofar as they're appealing to like romantic references to emotion and other sort of features in order to justify their positions, rather than appealing to a necessarily materialist reality. Now, they will make materialist arguments sometimes if they think they can get away with them, right? So they might try to, for instance, give a scientific account of their view of race or something like that. But certainly, like, the way that fascism plays upon the emotions is a little bit more in the idealist category, right? So I'm not certain if this mere image aspect works as well upon like further examination, right? Because idealism just seems to be, it sounds like, at least from the description that we've been given of Tlön, that to the extent that there are materialists and there's people who believe in like the continuity of objects, they are an incredibly small minority view, right? This is like maybe, equivalent might be like Spinoza, right? It's like, here's one random dude who maybe wrote some very interesting philosophy on materialism and Tlön, but his works are very obscure and not engaged with very much. The other thing that I would sort of wonder about is in terms of this, I guess this is me just like kind of throwing wrenches in, and I'm going to be curious how you guys respond to them. In terms of interpreting this as a critique of totalizing ideologies, I mean, one thing that I noticed that I thought was very interesting is the way that Tlön, both in terms of its internal like characteristics and in terms of the way that it was created in the first place, seems to consist of like multiple different voices speaking in multiple different ways, right? Like, we're told that the Renier are like the product of different people going out and searching for the same object, right? And then acquiring multiple versions of those objects. So like, if it was a totalizing ideology in Tlön, you would figure that they would all come to the conclusion that there's a singular example of this object. They wouldn't be finding loads and loads of them and having each of them being distinct in a little sort of meaningful way, right? And then in the process of creating these books, we find out that there are like Berkeley was involved, right? And Berkeley, from what I understand, was a very sort of religious philosopher, whereas later on you have this rich Southerner who comes along and explicitly wants it to be a repudiation of Jesus Christ. So it does seem to me that the system of Tlön isn't as totalizing as we necessarily think it is, because it seems as though there are, while they're all versions of idealism, right, it seems as though there's a plurality of opinions in Tlön, and then it seems as though the people who were responsible for crafting this narrative also had a plurality of reasons for why they were sort of approaching it. So I'd be curious to hear what you guys have to say about that.
Yes.
Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Okay, so one thing I think you can think of is that it's not, so I think, yeah, there's definitely, he says that there's, because they kind of denounce this real difference in a lot of ways, that actually leads to a kind of multiplicity of these things. So in the same way they say that nouns aren't real, but then they say that basically all nouns can be subsumed under their language. In the same way they say, I think that about sciences, I believe.
And
that,
authors. They say it about authors.
Yeah, and authors too, that there's a single author, but then, as Sean was just pointing out, there's also this kind of plurality to things that really actually have an effect. So I think that's interesting, but then in a certain way, I don't think we should get caught up in saying basically, you know, that this is simply against idealism, and that whatever is most similar to idealism is what that this is like a polemic against that. Because I think in a certain way, what this really is kind of the problematic aspects of it are basically that this thing is kind of like a metaphor for just cultural systems in general. If you think about, you know, he says basically that like each individual had only an infinitesimal aspect to this, that it was, you know, this huge generational system. And I think you can see that it's like, that's what we're all adding to with, you know, the big other, the symbolic order of reality in general, that, you know, all you have to do is turn on the TV and that's it right there. And we all fall prey to that. Reality, you know, can only bend to its will. And the same way, we build up our lives based off this image that we get off these shared symbolic systems that we participate in, just by the fact that we're social beings living in this society. And you have technology that's basically just accelerated that exponentially. So I'm reading this book, Borges. So it's basically about post-humanism and Borges. First of all, amazing name, but it makes some really good points that basically there's no real technology necessarily, you know, at least the way that we think of it in, you know, digital technology, of course, it's written in 1940, but he foresaw all these things in a kind of theoretical way. And I think that's important to understand, you know, what's going on in a real essential way with this story, about how we're kind of creating these seemingly kind of self-encapsulated human realities that nevertheless blend into ours to the point where we can't distinguish them anymore. And I think you could throw in Baudrillard here and his idea of the procession of the simulacra, because that seems to be what this has foreshadowed. And I think that actually Baudrillard, he opens Simulacra and Simulation up with a Borges story about a map of a territory that supersedes the territory itself, to the point where the territory is destroyed and all there is the map. So I think there's a lot of different avenues you can go in this sense, but I think that connection is very, very important, that in the sense of a kind of a technological acceleration of what he's talking about here. And it's not necessarily even that like technology is like working through idealism necessarily, but if anything has a kind of totalizing humanism to it, it's basically that technology is trying to impose that for us, you know, and that's, you know, virtual reality. The idea of virtual reality is kind of that. It's this creation of this totally human world that nevertheless will bleed into our own even outside of it. So yeah.
And I
Neurologically, we're almost already there. I mean, even without the virtual reality, it's basically what happens.
well, I wanted to go back because the original question, I apologize, I don't remember it exactly, but it prompted me to think of that line, Buckley did not believe in God, but nevertheless wished to demonstrate to the non-existent God that mortal men were capable of the world. I love that sentence. But if you think about it, how does one assert, if one accepts the tenets of Christianity and the real sermons of Jesus, that's the explanation of the world, then you're caught in somebody else's system. I mean, that line about Buckley, nevertheless wishing to demonstrate to the non-existent God that mortal men were capable of conceiving a world, was an assertion, right? A rejection. And we can, even if I can't, we can, whatever the we is of that secret society, can create this. And I don't know why, but when Chase was talking, and when I apologize, I'm blanking on your name, who asked the question. What's your name?
Sean.
Sean, thank you. I'm sorry. I thought of, anybody ever watch Rick and Morty?
Yeah.
Okay. Remember the Rick and Morty episode when they're on the train and it's actually, they're part of a story, and the only way they get out of it from the station master or whatever is they invoke Jesus. And Rick says to Morty, oh, this is every writer's living hell, being stuck in the Bible. I just thought of that when I thought of Ezra Buckley, right? That if being stuck in the Bible means that's the realm, right? That's the totalistic system.
Yeah. So another kind of direction, well, it's related, but also kind of a tangent, like most of the things I say. But anyways, so I think what Borges is talking about here is he's saying, you know, there's these inhuman laws that we can't comprehend, yet there is also this aspect, this plasticity that we can affect about our reality. And I think what he's kind of saying here is that, yes, we need to be cautious about this real power that we have, but also I think there's a kind of like almost an empowering sense to this, that, you know, our imagination, our fictions have a real causal power to them. So maybe we should actually be more cautious of how we create things that bleed into our own world. And I think there's a lot of so Borges, he studied a lot of, you know, occultism and esoteric systems, and there's all these references to Gnosticism. I think studying something like just magic in general, and that this thing has been going on, you know, how many thousands of years people have been studying basically this exact thing. How do we have our will create things into reality? And in a lot of ways, you can see that technology is a kind of extension of this thinking, that, you know, these objects of our imagination, our will, it can actually, we can manifest these things. Of course, in a different sense than how you would normally think of it. But so Nick Land, if you guys know who that is, I see Sean smiling. So he talks about hyperstition, this idea of fictions that can become real. And you can look at all kinds of things that fit this description, from, you know, a monetary system, a lot of things. Okay, so one example I think is good is the panic buying that people had from, you know, the COVID thing, where they bought all the toilet paper. Okay, so in Australia, there was a fear because they got their toilet paper from China, And then there were basically images online of people not being able to buy it in Australia. And then you got images of people in Australia kind of showing off how they are hoarding it. This spread around the internet to the point where people in America then were kind of, it's basically these images are viral themselves because then people try to mimic this. So it becomes this mimetic image system where then the people in America bought all this toilet paper, and then there really was no toilet paper. So they created this thing based off these, viral images and things like that. I think this is going all through our society, and that this story kind of gets to the heart of these things. But then it's saying basically, we have all these stupid uses of this power of imagination to affect reality. Why can't we do something intelligent about it? Really create something that's worth creating instead of, toilet paper, panic buying crises or whatever.
Dude, go ahead, Joey.
I was going to say, like, another thing that's kind of sticking out to me is the idea that while they're creating these worlds or disseminating these artifacts throughout the world, that the whole thing of divine laws or inhuman laws is still ringing out to me, along the idea that, like, we can create things, but we're not exactly in control of how they're going to go about and influence the world. And just the idea of, showing that mortal man was capable of conceiving a world. They want to create a world, but what happened, they start putting out these encyclopedias, is that they start this revision cycle. And it's naturally the world they're trying to create, as if it's some static ordered world, is nevertheless subject to these laws that are going to make it keep being revised and just create further artifacts, and it's still going to keep changing. So that part is just interesting to me. And those changes aren't necessarily going to be at the full intent of each creator, right? Each creator's only giving his little infinitesimal portion.
Yeah. So Nick Lane, he talks about hyperstition as a kind of, it's actually, Nick Lane is basically trying to destroy the bourgeois subject and try to, it's a way of, the ideas have an agency themselves. And it's just humans that are kind of the functionaries of these hyperstitional ideas that bring themselves into existence through human society. So I think he's trying to understand these inhuman laws, and part of that is this capacity of certain ideas to basically create themselves through different mediums. So I think that's pretty important to understand that these ideas aren't necessarily idealistic in themselves, because somebody like Nick Land, he's trying to totally get rid of idealism, and he's part of this kind of a speculative realism. So yeah, I'll take that for what it's worth.
Can I real quick, have any of y'all ever heard of Rocco's Basilisk?
Yes.
No, not me.
Nope.
Okay, so I will do my best to describe it. It's sort of like a techno-futurist's version of Pascal's wager. So it's a little bit weird, but basically Rocco's Basilisk is a incredibly powerful artificial intelligence that, if created, will basically torment forever in a digital hell everyone who didn't work to bring it into existence. So right now, we should all be working to bring Rocco's Basilisk into existence, because if we aren't, then Rocco's Basilisk in the future will make duplicates of our consciousness and torture us forever in a cybernetic hell.
I think Elon Musk is a part of this. That's my theory.
You think that Elon Musk is working towards building Rocco's Basilisk?
Yeah, because, okay, so I don't know if you guys know who Grimes, his
Yes, exactly.
girlfriend is, but they met because of some kind of Twitter reference to Rocco's Basilisk, so he knows about it. He's very aware of it.
It sounds like the type of thing
It's just a theory, but I mean, come on.
He's expressed discomfort with AI, so if he's
Yeah,
he might be actively trying to appease the future AI.
exactly. So I think he's kind of torn between this, where he's aware of the danger of it, but then he's like, oh my God, what if this really happens? You know, and he's all about the idea of the, you know, simulation theory and whatnot. So I think Elon Musk is, okay, you know, there's like this crazy nihilistic millionaire that's funding Tlön and whatnot, right? Okay, Elon Musk is that guy. It's being created right now. You heard it first right here.
That it's definitely like, I mean, this concept, because the way that I sort of experienced Rocco's Basilisk when I first learned about it is it seems like if you're a person who's bought into a certain style of like futurist rationalistic reasoning, then you like hear about Rocco's Basilisk and then you're just like, fuck. Because it's like it in the same way that Pascal's wager seems to be very compelling to a person who's already sort of a religious believer. If you sort of buy into this framework, then it's sort of like, oh, well, obviously there's this utilitarian action where if I want to minimize suffering and maximize a pleasure, and it seems as though Rocco's Basilisk is something that could exist, so it's a possibility.
Right.
Well, either I work to build Rocco's Basilisk, which protects me, right, prevents me from experiencing an eternity of suffering, or I don't, in which case, well, whenever Rocco's Basilisk does get built, then I will experience an eternity of suffering. It's like this, it's like a virus, right? It's like it gets into people's heads and it's just like, it makes the wheels turn in a specific sort of way.
Until someone writes the essay or story about the anti-basilisk, an alternative AI that will torture those who worked to build the other one.
That's a brilliant idea. Oh my God.
We must build an AI that will actively try to stop anyone else from building Rocco's.
We'll torture them if they have tried.
So I, you know, somewhat in response to Sean's earlier question about, you know, trying to create a sort of totalizing view of the thing. I still think, the totalizing thing, maybe that still seems fairly compelling to me, but what still does seem very compelling to me is that a primary tension here is between materialism and metaphysical materialism and metaphysical idealism. And, you know, like that's why that thing that you pointed out with the Renier or whatever it is seems to be contrary to what's been going on, or, you know, to this notion of thinking of Tlön as being this one kind of idealistic world, because now you have these individuals constructing these objects. But what, you know, on the page right before that, he's talking about this, you know, very daring hypothesis that there is only one subject. And so, you know, so I'm wondering if what he's doing is he's just, again, I mean, to use the mirror analogy, it's like Tlön is a mirror, an idealistic mirror of our metaphysical materialistic world. And so in the same way, you have different materialistic hypotheses to cope with various difficulties and problems with materialism. You know, maybe you have a similar parallel in the idealist world. So if you want to interpret this world idealistically, one way to explain why there is this coherence in the world is to say what Berkeley said, which was there is one God that is injecting these appearances into all our minds, and that's why our experiences are coherent. Yeah, we're nothing but minds, but it's not radical subjective idealism, because we're not constructing our own realities. Rather, God is constructing these realities, but it's still pure idealism. But then if that's the case, you know, you have problems with how do you that we've been kind of talking about. How do you deal with human freedom, and how do you deal with variations in the system that don't seem to be completely? Yeah, and so then maybe the Renier is kind of the counterpoint, you know, within that idealistic framework. Well, yeah, you've got this, you know, this cosmic subject, but that's going to generate problems. So then you have maybe this other possible way of looking at that, where you have these Renier, which are really almost like not subjective idealism, but like rather than there being a central subject that's determining reality, it's something like a consensual reality. You know, we all agree that this is what reality is going to be, and then that reality comes into being. And those two forms of idealism are sort of in tension with one another. And so again, maybe it's just sort of an idealistic parallel to what you have in a materialistic world. I can't think of a parallel right off the top of my mind, but you know, there's these different ways of trying to interpret phenomena in terms of materialism that are in tension with one another.
Mm-hmm.
As I almost feel like what Sean wasn't you saying something about like how the fact that our world was so quick to yield and jump over to the side of the idealist Tlön's system was kind of like a hole in the idea that he was mirroring our world as some sort of materialist world.
I don't know if I said that, but that seems like a very good observation, so I like it.
That's what I had understood.
I'll claim it.
For it.
I'll take credit for it, but just be aware, I don't think I actually said it. But
yeah, like if our world was so...
In terms of metaphysical materialism, though, I think we are completely... I mean, I guess I don't see the problem there, because in terms of metaphysical materialism, everyone I know almost is a metaphysical materialist. Whether they...
Yeah, so I guess then maybe the question would be this whole entire fictional world he's created, not just Tlön, but even the people in it are a mirror to our materialistic world.
Yeah, maybe. Because, you know, like one of the interesting things is, well, this happened to me, actually, it wasn't in the 19th century philosophy class where we talk about idealism directly, but one time when I taught existentialism and phenomenology, and when we're starting phenomenology and we're talking about Husserl, and you know, Husserl says things like, how is it phrased? There is no world without consciousness. And when you cash that out, he is not saying, it's not subjective idealism. He is not saying that somehow consciousness manufactures the world. But that phrase was so troubling to a particular student, you know, because he's so grounded in reductionist materialism that he would just, you know, beat on this day after day after day. And after 2 weeks, he dropped the class because it was like, you know, he could not stand to be hearing that phrase every other day for 2 weeks, you know, that, and so it, you know, I think, you know, in our world, we have absorbed metaphysical materialism to such a degree. Like what, you know, one of the, you know, I sometimes wonder, how do I phrase this? If metaphysical materialism is the dominant myth of our age, because it is simply unquestionable. So, you know, like during the Christian era, if you said there is no God, people thought you were just insane, because it is obvious that there is a God. I mean, it is the most obvious fact that there is a God. I mean, they wouldn't just accuse you of being a heretic. They would think you were stupid, right? It's insane. Well, metaphysical materialism is like that today. If you challenge metaphysical materialism, or you even get close to it to something like some forms of phenomenology, people just go, what bullshit, you know? And they don't want to, they just think that's nuts. And so that's one reason why I think there's, you know, maybe this, you know, as Ed said, this sort of dogmatism about metaphysical views. I wonder if it's been a long time since I've read Borges, but you know, my vague recollection is he just kind of pokes at this over and over and over, these sort of fundamental assumptions that, well, yeah, I know basically how the world works, and anyone who disagrees with that is just stupid. And he just kind of needles people on that point.
Whenever I was reading the initial, whenever I was reading the initial like portion, like the initial idea that kind of struck me, even, you know, after kind of thinking about the time period that he was writing this in, and really, you know, writing a critique on what like the rise of fascism looked like, especially around the world, and how, you know, entire nations of people who are, considered civilized or industrial Anglo-Saxon nations were, almost swindled into believing this lie that, Hitler or Mussolini were feeding, the populace at the time. Even beyond that, just thinking about what gets lost in terms of cultural submission into, the zeitgeist of what we take with us forward into the future, and who gets to decide, what's important, what's not, what cultural artifacts or symbology comes into what we call history. And so it kind of really posed a really deep question inside of myself of, as a society, who is getting to choose what's valuable from cultures and what's not, and most importantly, what are we leaving behind that may have a lot of intrinsic value, or at least when it comes to challenging or really evaluating that dogmatism of saying this is the way the world works because of this system or this structure. What are we, or who are we doing it a service to by not taking some of that stuff into consideration in terms of like who's writing history, basically. And to me, it very, reading the introduction about the fact that, if he was a French or an English poet, he would be more celebrated than he currently is. And then really taking that into consideration, and then using the intentional language of calling the encyclopedia, Anglo. And it's very real that, for the most part, at least, the collective history of the West has been dominated by whatever, those principles or those ideals that Anglo mentality takes with it. And so, what intrinsic value do we lose, like even just looking at stuff like tribalism or community? What do we lose whenever we're moving forward without really giving consideration to those as like the zeitgeist of what the world looks like?
Yeah, I think it's interesting that he uses the idea of the kind of the figure of an encyclopedia. Like, this is the book we go to learn hard, cold facts, and that this is kind of this medium of...
But an insert, like an odd piece that's not in most copies of that encyclopedia, and that encyclopedia itself is a bootleg of a different encyclopedia. Like, the encyclopedia begins as a very questionable authority.
Yeah, and I think that's what he's getting at, in the sense that, he didn't use this idea of the... Oh, my cat's freaking out. Hold on. Oh, his claw's stuck in my pants. Technical difficulties. Okay, I think it's... All right, I think it's okay. So the encyclopedia... I think what he's getting there is, what we think of as, these cold hard facts. It's like, well, who's writing these things? And I don't think he's saying, that, history is totally fake or whatever, but I think he's trying to complicate it. Like, he tries to complicate everything and get us to think, yeah, well, who exactly is writing this? Where are they coming from? So this author, Robert Anton Wilson, he wrote a book where he got some like 10 different encyclopedias and showed there's competing ideas in all of them for all these different historical events to kind of show that.
He's pointed out on a number of occasions, depending which edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica you get, tells you different things, including one of the early ones repeats that idea that California was an island off the Pacific coast of America.
Interesting.
Which is obviously true.
Wilson has said a man who has one encyclopedia is certain of things. A man who has two sets of encyclopedias is never certain.
Exactly. I think that's why he's using this idea of the encyclopedia is it's just going after that idea of like this totalizing of history. And so he mentions also but I think also there's a danger of totalizing that and saying like all history is fake. So he uses actually that one of the kind of like the mythological descriptions where he's describing what the people in Tlön believe. He talks about the Gnostic idea that all of history was a dialogue of a god with a demon or something. I need to find it.
Oh yeah.
But
Well, yeah, it goes back to the Gnostic idea that it was a lesser god or a demigod,
yeah,
Right.
that created the material world. And that's why we yearn to be away from this to get into our higher, better selves.
Page 10 on the.
yeah. Okay, I see it here. So, that the history of the universe, and in it our lives in the most tenuous detail of our lives, is the scripture produced by a subordinate god, the demiurge, in order to communicate with a demon. Yeah. And that's just like one idea out of, 5 or whatever that he gives in this paragraph. But I think that's,
What does the paragraph start
Does that make the world? Oh, sorry.
It's right before the stuff about the copper coins. It's the
Oh, okay.
couple paragraphs right before that.
It sucks because so I'm definitely using a different edition from the rest of you guys. But like the page numbers almost line up. Like it'll either, when you give me a page number, it'll either be on that page or it'll be one ahead or one, like it'll be like right by it. So, but it's like,
what edition are you using?
So this is, let me see here. Copyright 1962, 1964, New Directions Publishing Corporation, Library of Congress, catalog card number, blah, blah, blah.
So that's probably a 64, and this one is the 2007.
Yeah, that's the one I have.
This one has an introduction by William Gibson in it. So,
which is really good, by the way.
I think before this, the one that Sean has was the standard edition.
Gotcha.
The introduction of that one, I think, was Andre Moreau.
This one has
Andre Moreau.
Oh, okay. So this one has an invitation by William Gibson, which is really good, by the way, and an introduction by James Irby, which is also in another one of the new edition ones.
That's the one that I have on my edition of it. Chase.
Oh yeah, I have a PDF of this book. It's the slightly older version of this one that I can send out. I forgot to do that yesterday, but I don't know if does anyone want it? A
Sure.
PDF?
Yeah, if you don't mind, that would be great.
Okay, I can send it out.
I kind of just borrowed this from my roommate because it was, it was like, oh, she already has a copy of it, so sure, whatever, I'll pick it up. But it would be really hilarious if there was like some sort of little detail in y'all's or minds that wasn't in the other one, and then we were like arguing about some random. That would have been amazing, but I don't. I haven't got so far that's happened.
As soon as as soon as we started talking about multiple editions and introductions, I was like, oh my God.
We need to, or at least I got an idea. Let's, as a seminar group, let's concoct our own copy of this, and a version, and then put it in bookstores as if it's a normal one, and fabricate like this whole story about, I don't know, something ridiculous that Borges said. I don't even know what, but just do it for just because reality will bend.
We'll bend to our wills.
Let's just do it because we're nihilists, and why not?
One thing that I was going to say, and it looks like Nevitz just sort of wandered off right as I was getting around to the.
Oh, he's coming back.
Okay. Do you have a notepad for us to start working on this alternative version?
I do.
Here's something I've got to share with you guys. I because I don't know some of these names in these stories. I looked some of them up. I haven't looked all of them up. And some of them are real historical figures and some aren't. And apparently Ezra Buckley is not, but there is an Ezra Buckley Foundation. And here's on their website, the Ezra Buckley Foundation is devoted to the destruction of history via the creation of false historical events. We are sympathetic to the goals and philosophies of chrononautic exon, but choose to take a more focused and directed path. Anyway.
Wait, was this in place before he wrote the story or after? Or
I think
what
it's
is time? I don't know.
After.
It's a relatively recent website.
Okay.
So I'm guessing it's someone who took the idea of Ezra Buckley, I assume from this book, and then created this Ezra Buckley Foundation that's dedicated to the destruction of history.
Wait, so does that mean that this is a hyperstition itself?
It would appear so.
did.
Oh my god. Okay, so
It only has
Tlön
language.
is really gonna.
So
It's like the Rosicrucian Order. It existed before it existed. It was
Yeah.
printed, it was written about before it existed. That's it.
So actually, Borges says in Kafka and his predecessors that basically a writer creates their own predecessors. They kind of retroactively go back and create this lineage.
Yeah.
And in the same way, well, Deleuze, he talks about how, what art should do is create a people for the future, a new people, a new kind of subjectivity that people will be drawn towards, like a strange attractor in chaos theory that these things kind of seem to lead to.
That makes sense to me. I was recently looking at like the old, should art reflect reality or should reality reflect art? Should art like try to inspire reality? And I started thinking about the origins of art as we know it were all either paintings of visionary experiences or sympathetic magic attempts to change the world. The initial intent of art is to change reality.
Yeah.
Not to document it.
Personally, I think that, Baudrillard in his Precession of the Simulacra, he says that at first art was meant to just kind of represent things, but I don't know if that's exactly true, because I think the way that the human mind worked, so sympathetic magic is this idea that you can kind of create a likeness to something, be kind of drawn towards it like a strange attractor in a sense. Like you draw on a cave, a deer, and that kind of has this natural capacity to actually draw deer. So I think art has always been kind of involved in this aspect of kind of drawing things out. Mm-hmm. And in some cases, art can be a warning, but, a lot of times even those warnings can be used as a playbook. Look at 1984, look at Brave New World. I think clearly those are warnings, dystopian novels, but then people have kind of, whether consciously or not, actually, that's kind of a good idea. Maybe we should do that.
Right.
So I think that goes back close to the idea of if there is kind of this natural, plasticity that's going on, and our art is becoming reality in some sense through some manner, we need to be responsible for these things. Right. We need to think very carefully about what we create, and we should use our creations knowing full well that they are cycling back with this feedback loop into reality.
Maybe that's what Einstein meant by you cannot simultaneously plan for and prevent war. I always took it as a practical, they're not going to trust you're not going to be an effective peacemaker if you're stockpiling your weapons because you're not trusting the person you're trying to make peace with. But maybe he was talking about you're putting that much ink on the page about you're creating the playbook for the war and trying to plan against the inevitables of it.
So it's almost like the idea of a attention economy where, the more attention you bring these things, it actually gets some kind of a power. And I think that's especially true with symbolic idea or, semiotics with signs, especially in a image-based society, the spectacle like that dominates our media. You have basically, the more attention these images get, the more power they get. This is, so, whether or not Platonism or magic is real, basically society, technology has created so that it is real. There's no doubt about it at all that we have basically created Plato's cave. So it doesn't even almost matter whether it exists or not because it's there. That's look at your TV, look at your computer screen. We're living in it. So we might as well, figure out its inhuman laws and try to work something that we can actually, believe in.
Every time the word laws has been used in this, for some reason, I keep coming back to, I don't remember, was it Lewis or who it was who said, to say a rock falls because it is obeying a law, even a universal one, is to not only make the rock a person, but to say it's a citizen.
Yeah, I've never liked the
anthropomorphism of the word law.
The metaphor of laws.
It's a weird metaphor. It seems very drawn from the idea of God setting everything into motion.
Yeah.
In a very anthropomorphic God.
It's a very, very post-Christian sort of conception of how the world operates.
Yeah, in the so in the other book we're reading,
the idea of a rock as a citizen, so it's a trade-off.
So Bergson, he questions the idea of laws and says instead we should think of these things as habits or tendencies.
Right.
I think I like that idea much more than laws. But in this sense, so I get that because Borges actually says that in here. He says basically that, okay, there's inhuman laws, but we kind of, superimpose these human laws onto those. So that's the only reason I would use laws, because I don't like that concept itself, really.
Right. It just keeps coming up every time I hear the word law today. I don't know why. That's not.
It's kind of separate.
In some ways, it's not post-Christian, but remember the deist sense of God as the great watchmaker, and then that the universe, the orbits of the planet, in an orderly fashion, so human beings can understand it, and then you just stepped aside.
Yep.
Well, Newton was a Christian, and Newton, he's the guy that codified a lot of some of these, like the law of gravitation, and I don't know
also an alchemist.
What the relationship between God and laws were, but
remember Whitehead, he says in Process and Reality that if you look at the metaphysics of Newton, it requires some kind of God that's outside of the world, the view from nowhere, in order to kind of condition this idea of like a universal space, universal homogeneous time, and all these things. I think he makes a good point. And also, I think if you look, our political system is also built off the same thing, in the sense of the idea of rights gained by who basically conditions those rights. It's God. That's what John Locke came up with. Basically, there's like this ultimate creator that actually endows these things, and I think you see that in most political philosophies, in the sense, the divine right of kings, and you have this idea of rights. You have to have some kind of a essentially metaphysical ultimate force endowing those rights. And then you also have these political systems of power to enforce those rights. So it's another, we kind of got off topic, but just to make that point.
Well, returning to the topic from through an odd angle from the gods, as you know, Chase, my first initial exposure to the existence of Jorge Luis Borges was the fact that he wrote There Are More Things, which was a sort of tribute to Lovecraft, a thing he wrote about Lovecraft because he was a Lovecraft fan, and it influences his work. And when I'm reading this book, I come to him automatically thinking of him as a Lovecraft fan. So my brain automatically goes into the gear to look for tentacles and strange angles. And what I start noticing, the most Lovecraftian part of the whole thing, other than the impossibility of finite words to grapple with that which is infinite, is the beginning, the setup of it, with the whole searching through scraps of information and the encyclopedia and the weird thing, right down to the Norwegian, which he lifted, I have no doubt he lifted that Norwegian from the Call of Cthulhu, where Lovecraft lifted it from 2 sources before him. But I just keep coming back to this like jarring thing that happens to me with the story. I'm like, it feels so very Lovecraftian, and then all of a sudden it jars into like the point of view of the people dealing with this reality beyond the materialistic reality, of this other reality that doesn't fit our maps. And I'm not exactly sure. I find it a startling sort of upheaval of the current that he starts off with, but it makes me wonder, I don't know, it makes me wonder, I guess, if it wasn't his attempt at seeing, well, maybe this is what those fish people from Renier think's going on.
Well,
Was it him just trying to create an alien?
Well, I apologize, I don't remember the source. I was reading multiple articles on Borges' literature, and there was a quotation from one of his friends, and he said, and he wasn't being sarcastic, but what he said is Borges had read literature that maybe 1 out of 10 people, intellectuals, would ever read, yet at the same time, he didn't read, at least 1/10 of what most normally educated people would have bumped into. And so right. Borges's education, to use more modern ways, was very uneven. I mean, he was taught at home until he was, I don't remember the age, of 10 or 14. And then remember, when he was 14, his parents took the whole family to Europe. They made it to Geneva, Switzerland, and all hell broke loose, and World War I happened. And it was when he was in Switzerland that he was introduced to literature of the Kabbalists, of Alexandrine Greek thought, and then medieval philosophers. And so I can't imagine any other major 20th century writer having that kind of, being steeped in that kind of literature.
Right.
Yeah.
I apologize for forgetting I can't imagine it was C.S. Lewis or C.P. Snow actually wrote a science fiction novel that Borges had read in the 1930s, and he was Borges very much admired H.G. Wells and Poe and Chesterton. And when you think of those writers, that's an interesting group.
I think you can kind of see Borges is, it's a very good point, bring up these different authors, because you can kind of see him as an example of what Deleuze talks about as a minor literature. This is a kind of like a literature that creates its own predecessors, and it kind of cuts out its own tradition, kind of in a transversal kind of way, so that it creates, a people to come. In the same way, I think Kafka did something similar, that basically he's not, and I think one thing that Borges, I think, is really interesting about Borges is, there's a lot of similarities thematically with, Kafka, with Lovecraft, with Philip K. Dick. Lovecraft and Philip K. Dick, they worked in very kind of genre-esque kind of ways because they had to, essentially, in order to survive and have food to eat. But Borges seems to have totally upturned any kind of genre conventions and essentially made his own genre. Like they call it, magical realism, but I think essentially he kind of shows, some people have talked about, this is also kind of science fiction, but there's basically none of the a lot of the tropes of science fiction are basically completely gone. You know, I was saying there's no technology, but then he seems to have, in some sense, kind of predicted cyberspace to a certain degree and other things. Like the later stories, you'll kind of see what I'm talking about. But yeah, I think that's very interesting that he's kind of creating something totally new here. But then also kind of what he's talking about is, you know, we need to think about what we're actually creating. So we actually, you know, kind of create something that's worth believing in. I think it's a good example of basically what he's done here. Like in his own literature, he's kind of, you know, presenting us an idea here, a very genuine, original literature that kind of creates its own reflection in a sense. But so to go back to H.P. Lovecraft, I don't know, are you guys very familiar with H.P. Lovecraft, or should I? So basically, he was kind of actually, I would say he created his own kind of genre too. Basically, they call it cosmic horror now, or Lovecraftian horror. This is the idea of basically, so a lot of horror at that time was very centered on supernatural elements that, you know, like the ghost comes and it's really scary. But he had a different idea where it's basically you have these different orders of reality. It's not something like there's something material and there's something immaterial from, you know, a transcendent realm that comes. It's basically different realms of reality that come and kind of intersect. And it shows the smallness of human reality. That's basically what it's all about. It's like these things that are incomprehensible to the human understanding come and invade people and cause them to go insane or whatever. And you can definitely see the thematic overlap here. Also to the point where, so a lot of the speculative realists like Nick Land, like Graham Harman, who wrote a book on Lovecraft, they have seen him as a very important philosophical kind of muse for their own work, which I think is very significant also, in the sense that I think ultimately what he's kind of trying to get at, Borges, in the sense of kind of showing that there's these inhuman laws, you know, and that there's this smallness to the human concept of reality that we need to kind of look past, look beyond that. And I think Lovecraft is a great example of, you know, of that same thing. And also you see that in these different philosophical currents also. So yeah, I'll stop there.
Well, can I get back to a point you made, Chase, independent of Lovecraft? And that was, in everything I've read about Borges, remember how I was talking about how it seems like he didn't read works that you would think any educated person would? When Chase mentioned that Borges created his own genre, I was thinking of that chapter from in Machiavelli's The Prince, where he talks about the creation of new modes and orders, right? And people have, in analyzing Machiavelli's The Prince, will say that even though Machiavelli said he made a distinction not between true and false prophets, but between armed and unarmed prophets, which for most people in the 1500s, that would have been very odd. You were a true or false prophet. What is this stuff about being armed or unarmed? And Machiavelli said, unarmed prophets fail, armed prophets succeed. But yet some people have said, you know, who were the two greatest unarmed prophets that seem to create a new mode and order? And one would be, in Ezra Buckley's term, that imposter Jesus Christ. And then the other one would be Machiavelli himself, right? With this idea of realism and practical politics and an amoral look at political thought. And it just struck me hard that was Borges warning himself, because this is a very important short story. And I'm very glad that Nevitt started us on this, because it's in the 1930s that Borges turns away from poetry and really embraces the short story. And he had a very serious accident that caused him to be struck with sepsis, and he almost died in 1938, which is when his father died. And it seems like something was happening, all coming together personally, politically, sociologically, with him, who seems to be so separate from the world around him, but yet he seems to be soaking up. And it's in this story that it seems to me he's doing something very new in terms of what had existed before. And I don't know, especially with Chase talking about creating his own genre, that is he warning himself that, hey, you know, I'm fearful of Nazism, I'm fearful of dialectical materialism, I'm fearful of any of these totalistic, but if I'm doing something that's really, really new, am I going to know how everything unfolds from that? Anyway.
Yeah, I felt like what I was going to say earlier, and it kind of goes along with what you're saying, is that I felt the same way about how I was like, I mean, I haven't read anything else by him. This is the first thing I've read, but I think that it was a really fitting first story for the book, because to me, it was almost like an argument how strong and valuable fiction can be. And I think that he creates this entirely fictional planet, you know, that has apparently been created by all these people and stuff. And I think that the beauty of that is that it's not necessarily based in reality as we see it, or the exact reality. You know, there are elements of reality, elements of our universe, but it's something new and different. And I think this argument that when he brings up, you know, 10 years ago, any symmetry with a semblance of order, dialectical materialism, anti-Semitism, Nazism, was sufficient to entrance the minds of men. I think what he's arguing is that people's favorite parts of those things are the fictions of them, the things that they can imagine, or the situations that they can imagine themselves in with that beautiful totalistic idea. You know, so I think he's kind of arguing that fiction is this incredibly powerful thing, and that if someone in their mind can imagine something entirely, then they can surround their entire realities around it, you know? And so, yeah, I think on one hand, it is this like, I should be careful, but also it's incredible that anyone has this ability, you know, that anyone can create a story and do this, and that we all have this ability, you know. And if we all came together and truly believed that the fictions we create could be reality, then we could change the world, you know. And so whether or not Tlön is something better than our world or not, it's this hopeful kind of thing of like, we can really change it, you know, we can change reality. So yeah,
definitely. I think there's definitely, you know, like that kind of empowering element to his understanding of fiction and whatnot, and that, you know, he's creating his own genre and giving us a totally different way of, maybe it's not totally different, but a different way of looking at the world. I think that's very significant, and that it's not just a simple warning against, you know, don't believe in idealism, don't, like, watch out for fictions. He's saying basically there's going to be fiction. The real is inconceivable without some kind of dimension of the imaginal mixed into it in ways that we can't actually separate. So instead, we should actually create these good fictions, these, you know, good, I probably shouldn't use that word in a philosophy seminar, but anyways, so
what do you mean by good?
Exactly, yeah. Basically, more aesthetically pleasing than Nazism. I'll go with that. That's my definition for good. So basically, let's
low bar.
Let's use something. Create these imaginal fictions that have this capacity to be more aesthetically pleasing, and so I think that element is definitely there. So it's not just simply a warning against these things, but he's also giving a warning against not only just like the power of these imaginations, these creations, but also with the idea of saying that we can separate these things totally. And I think that's where you get like these ideas of these totalizing systems, like you're talking about, you know, the kind of like scientism of, you know, of material science turned into a totalizing ideology of, you know, complete realism, where there it's extremely clear, you know, where the imagination is, where fiction is, and where reality is. And I think he's trying to show that that is not at all how reality actually works. Actually, reality is full of these idealizations, these theories. I mean, just the scientific method is, in order to do the scientific method, you have to hypothesize. That requires an imagination. That requires basically a framework of thinking. So I think I'm probably preaching to the choir here somewhat, but so there's all these different dimensions to his idea. But yeah, I think Travis, you make a really good point there.
Thank you.
I have this is a non sequitur, but when Alex was talking about the encyclopedia and noting that this is on page, this is like the second page of the story, the Anglo-American Encyclopedia, and then he says, we later determined that there was no difference between both of them are reprints of the 10th encyclopedia. So I didn't really pay any attention to that. I mean, I noted that, but I didn't really try to get any significance from it. And then he mentions the Anglo-American Encyclopedia a few more times. And, you know, one obvious thing that I missed was the one that Alex brought up was, you know, a rather pointed, probably, acknowledgement of the dominance of Anglo-American literature. I mean, do you think there's any, I mean, as a general question, is there any other, my mind is just wondering, is there any other significance to the fact that this starts off as a reprint of the original encyclopedia? You know, is it like a simulacrum kind of a thing going on, or is there?
I was just about to say that. Yeah. Well, okay, so Baudrillard, he says basically that it's through the technologies of reproduction that this kind of loss of the real happens. So I think it'd be significant in the sense that it's a reprint. That, and also that's itself a kind of a paradox that something new is coming out of a reprint, something where it's basically like there is something real before, but then in reprinting it became something less real.
I mean, I think even more literally, like think of the conceptually what gets lost in translation from just Spanish to English. Conceptually, you have like different colloquialisms, you have different translational meanings, any kind of whatever idioms that were present culturally at the time don't really translate or contextually make sense. And so even thinking about just at a more basic level, like what part of that really does truly get lost translating from language to language, from, you know, the person who's the scribe who is literally translating this or that is making these decisions in the moment to say, well, this makes more sense to me, so, you know, I'm going to phrase it or frame it this way, and then that just kind of gets accepted as, you know, the de facto, like, this is truth, or, you know, this is what is real, or, you know, this is what's been made real by, you know, the biases or the preconceived notions of what they think the author was trying to say. And so I think that's a pretty powerful reminder to just be considerate of, especially whenever you're looking at someone writing in different languages, to that a lot of things do get lost in translation conceptually.
And then of course we're reading a translation of Borges.
Yeah, he wrote a bunch of stuff about translation specifically. I've never read any of it, so I don't know exactly what he says, but I think he's basically saying the same thing, that the process of translation itself is a complication. And But I mean, you can go like a major theological debate that is happening, you know, especially in the Western world, the Bible being, you know, the Word of God, is a English translation still the Word of God? You know, if it's originally written in Koine Greek or
Only if it's the
Hebrew and
King James
Aramaic?
version, because God did a miracle and made it so that the King James Bible translation, it's actually better. It's actually the more correct version than even the original Hebrew Greek.
Absolutely.
Wow, God is so amazing, guys.
Isn't he?
Wow.
If I could get back to Borges translation, I have different copies of this short story, and the one is in Labyrinths, but another one was in an edited book by Alistair Reed and Emir Rodriguez Monegal called Borges a Reader, and it jumped out at me that line one of you mentioned, I apologize, about that the history of the universe and the most tenuous detail of our lives is the scripture produced by a subordinate God in order to communicate with the demon. In this other version, they have, instead of saying is the scripture, they just put is the handwriting produced by a minor God in order to communicate with the demon. And I'm thinking, my Spanish isn't great, but handwriting and scripture are completely different words. And so I would love to know what was the word that was translated, the one by handwriting and the other by scripture, because to me, scripture...
I have this Spanish right here.
Okay. What do you have, Chase?
So you're looking for the words for...
35 of the Labyrinths in English. That the history of the universe and in it our lives and the most tenuous detail of our lives is the scripture, but small s, is the scripture produced by a subordinate God in order to communicate with the demon. And this is history of our lives produced by a minor God, not a subordinate God, but a minor God in order to communicate with the demon. But is the handwriting produced by a minor God? And the one we're looking at is scripture. And
let me see if I find. I think at least the word minor. I think that's the same in Spanish. I believe, like menor. I believe. I don't know.
But the word that really the change though is handwriting versus scripture, because
handwriting. Okay, let me see if I can find that.
Various differences.
Yeah, was this even just trying to find it in here?
Well, if you go. Oh, okay. And if I could make one other point, and I apologize for being biographical about Borges, but Borges' background was Spanish and English. And in fact, as a child, his nickname by his family was Jorge, not Jorgito. And he learned English, equivalent of being in grade school. And so he actually learned English. I think he may have even learned English before he learned Spanish. And to me, what's striking about Borges is even though he's attacked or was attacked for not being truly Argentinian, he certainly had a facility with the English language. And it's interesting to me that he consciously chose to compose his essays and short stories and poetry in Spanish when it seems to me he was certainly not antagonistic to English as a language of literature, as a language of poetry and short stories and fiction in general. So it seems to me that he made a conscious choice to write in the dominant language of his country, and actually, frankly, to go back to Argentina, even though he did love to travel, especially when there was a dictatorship running around in Argentina. So anyway, I think that one of the reasons why he reached for the Anglo, the Anglo encyclopedia could be connected, Alex, to your point of the dominance of the Anglo effect on Western culture, but it also is a reflection of, I think, him. Because he said the greatest part of his education was his father's library. Did you find it, Chase? In Spanish?
I could not find it, but it's looking like I'm finding a whole bunch of words in the Spanish that are not in the English, where I'm even confused if I'm looking at the right story, and it seems like they even put the wrong name on some of the for the story. Like they put so the next story is The Garden of Forking Paths, or in Spanish, El Jardín de Senderos que se bifurcan.
Yes.
So they're putting that title above the one above Tlön, Uqbar, Orbis Tertius. So I'm in the labyrinth right now.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, it might just be ordered differently, because I think my version, my different English translation has a slightly different order of short stories than y'all's does.
Yeah, I had to look and double check, but basically this story that I'm looking at is the one about Tlön, but it put the wrong title above it. But then he's putting a bunch of stuff here that I don't remember. Like he uses the phrase "Brave New World" in here.
Yeah, he puts it in quotation marks.
Okay,
But see,
maybe I just don't remember. Yeah.
no, he does. No, it is. He puts it in. Well, in the Labyrinths version of it, he does put "Brave New World," and I want to say it's in quotation marks. In fact, it jumped out at me when I was looking at it again, because I hadn't caught that the first 15 times I read it. And again, going back to Borges' own education, I'm not sure if that was in reference to Huxley's Brave New World, or remember where Huxley took it from. Huxley took the phrase Brave New World from William Shakespeare's The Tempest.
Yep.
Oh, I was not aware of that.
Yeah, I could see it being a Shakespearean. Can I say Shakespeare?
Every title in English literature has been taken from Shakespeare. This is my experience.
Wasn't there something in one of the introductions that kind of referenced something about invoking Shakespeare in text, and kind of saying like to invoke it is to be Shakespeare, I think is what I remember reading.
Yeah, I remember something about that too.
That any man who recites Shakespeare becomes Shakespeare.
And maybe that's kind of like his kind of semi-pretentious flex of saying that, I am of two worlds basically, but I'm choosing to write in Spanish, but I'm also able to self-reference, a lot of this I guess old world, knowledge or mastery of storytelling.
I'll get this tonight.
I apologize. In Labyrinths, Brave New World is not in parentheses. It's just in the text. It's right after he talks about the
just a little bit. I pulled out of that
laboring away darkly and modestly. Who are the inventors of Tlön? And before that, it's part of the paragraph in the 11th volume, in the second part of the short story. I mentioned there were allusions to the preceding and succeeding volume.
So a bit sort of random, but two things. One, so is the I don't know about the sort of Anglo-American Encyclopedia versus Encyclopedia Britannica, but right, we have these two different versions of the Anglo-American Encyclopedia, right? We have the one with the Uqbar entry and the one without the Uqbar entry. Mm-hmm. Is the one with the Uqbar entry a Renier? It has the one quality that we have associated with second gen Renier, which is that it is slightly longer than the first gen, right? Because it's longer by 3 pages.
That's clever.
I didn't notice that until you started mentioning it, but I was like, is it a
that's yeah, I bet you're right, because when they're talking about the Renier, they're talking about sending out people to look for things, right? Mm-hmm. So these guys, this guy has this vague recollection, and so they go on this search, right? So they're searching for this, and then it appears before them. So
slightly longer.
The slightly longer, exactly. So I mean, that again makes me think he's he's trying to, or I wonder if he's sort of poking fun at a reductionist materialist worldview and saying, you know, you could interpret our world in these sort of idealistic terms, and it would potentially be consistent with this other way of viewing the world.
Yeah.
Okay, I finally found the Spanish that is translated to scripture. It's escritura.
Escritura.
Yeah, which I think that's somewhat straightforward. It's like scripture writing. Yeah.
Right. But in your Spanish, Chase, is it a small e?
Yes.
Okay.
Do they capitalize it when it's the other?
No, mine is not capitalized.
Okay.
Yeah. So
to me, that's a better translation, because I think when something, I know you can have idioms and you can have turns of phrase, but libro, isn't libro?
Book.
Well, I mean, are you gonna translate a pamphlet? No,
you can in some cases, I guess.
But I mean, you know, sometimes it seems to me that you can a translator can have too much license. Gives yourself too much license, and that can really change.
And calling this handwriting is taking far too much license in your view.
Oh God, yes. If what Chase said about what the word is, you know,
escritura.
Escritura. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I took Latin, and in the last semester we translated the first two books of Virgil's Aeneid. And to do that, I would get basically 3 different versions that had already been translated, put them next to each other with the Latin, give my own translation. Those 3 translations of the English were often wildly different. And part of it is Latin is a little more complex because the order of the words is, you know, you can go all over the place. But that taught me how insanely different translations can be. And I think that's true with pretty much any language, but it goes beyond that, and because that's just one aspect of the complications you get with text themselves, in a sense that, you know, I think there's a reason why a lot of the post-structuralists like Derrida and, you know, Baudrillard, as we talked about, or at least I talked about, were into Borges, because he was one of the first people to like pay really close attention to this idea of textuality, hypertextuality, and things like that. And I think those are some really interesting dimensions that I think we'll probably have to explore more later, because he really gets into these ideas of textuality, especially, you know, authorship and things like that. All these themes that were crucial to, you know, like Roland Barthes and Foucault and people like that, about, you know, because basically before, you know, the idea of like author intention has like this, you know, one-to-one corresponds with the meaning of the text, and then they come and complicate that and say, no, language has kind of its own agency. The text has its own agency that supersedes the author's intent. And I think Borges, he was probably one of the first people that was, I think, really aware of that and influenced a lot of those ideas. So there's another interesting dimension to this. I think Borges is probably one of the most philosophically interesting writers of fiction I've ever read. That is just the philosophical implications that he talks about. I know of no other fiction writer that can, in a lot of ways, his fiction is more philosophical than a lot of the straight philosophy that I've read. if you go to Barnes and Noble, look at the philosophy sections, I would say this has more philosophical interest to it than a lot of the things that you'll find in, the philosophy section.
I mean, to even kind of invoke Ponty, I think that he found like his medium with which to really communicate and ask a lot of these questions to society at large as, we move forward with this history, or like what we collectively say, okay, this is what we've had in the past, and this is what we want to invoke for the future.
Yeah, he definitely has the whole kind of interrogative aspect of philosophy. That's what he does is, he presents kind of these illustrations of thought experiments, but always in a way that's asking a question. He doesn't give answers at all. He just simply presents scenarios that are themselves questions that we can ask for ourselves, but not in a way where they have any kind of definite answer. And that's what's so interesting about it, and what is so rich about it is that, these aren't simply straight, moralistic ideas about, watch out for fascism or whatever necessarily. It's so much more complex than that. It's so much more multifaceted than that.
It becomes timeless that way. I mean, even think of it about the example of the language of latency from invisible and invisible, of thinking it conceptually of, latent as in dormant, but then also in the digital age, what latency means and how it really does like parallel conceptually how the language has evolved. And that's a really cool concept to be able to have something like this that is given new contextual meaning based upon what challenges of society really, come to light as a result of, things like fascism, the digital age, information, disinformation, who gets to control that, what controls that.
Yeah, that's what, so this book, Borges, that I'm also reading, it talks about that a lot too, that basically there's kind of this latency in Borges' work that applies so well to developments of technology. And that, he kind of touched upon this kind of ambivalent richness that allows it to be timeless, to apply to all these timely things. And I think that's one of the great, one of the, the hallmarks of great literature is that you can go back to them and they gain new meanings as time goes on. They have a kind of virtuality in the Deleuzian sense of a kind of potential that is always there, but not there in a spatial way, but there in a potential. It's always present, but sometimes it doesn't come into fruition until much later. And then you see like, oh my God, he was talking about this in a way for, 100 years ago or whatever.
Right. I hope I don't sound pedantic, but when I was rereading this, and then certain things you all have picked out of importance. One, this is a very long short story for Borges. Okay, this is one of the
this is one of the longest, I think, in the whole book.
I mean, it's ridiculous. Well, it's not ridiculously long. I mean, but it's ridiculously long for him. And secondly, notice the paragraphing. I mean, sometimes it seems to me and I apologize for saying it this way, but if I was a sophomore teacher of English composition, I might say, I think you need to break the paragraph, because there seems to be he kind of is almost like carried away within multiple paragraphs with certain tangential ideas that you're like, wait a second, is what I'm reading in the last 20% what I was expecting to read in the first 20% of the same paragraphs? And to me, there's there's a looseness without laziness, but I would think it would have had to have come at a great cost of composition, because I don't see this writing being accidental, even though it comes across almost as if he's an intellectual talking. Anyway, I just wanted to share that thought.
I think he kind of he's in a lot of ways he writes in a very ironic style where he's kind of mimicking a sort of scholarly attitude, right, which I think he, in a way, he kind of had, but he's almost kind of like making fun of himself in a way that I think is actually pretty modern or postmodern, hyper-modern, where, you know, in our generation, the meme generation, we can only think in basically like these different levels of irony. I think he's doing something similar where he's kind of, you know, poking fun at his own style of writing when he's doing it.
Well, let me give you an example. It's on my edition of Labyrinths, it's at the bottom of page 37, and it starts with the line, "Centuries and centuries of idealism have not failed to influence reality." Well, look at the next sentence. "In the most ancient regions of Tlön, the duplication of lost object is not infrequent." I'm sorry, what do those two things have to do with each other? I mean, and then he's off on, and then I don't know how to pronounce HRO umlaut NIR.
Yeah, that one, Hornier.
I've been calling him Renier. I like to trill my R's though.
Okay.
Renier.
When you have an umlaut over an O, is that supposed to elongate the O?
That's kind of like a like that.
Yeah, well, KOLN, what we say Cologne is Köln, München is supposed to be the elongation. And that's why I look at that and think, I want to hear someone pronounce it who knows how to pronounce it.
Well, it's a fabricated language, so.
True.
I like Sean's pronunciation.
Which is what?
Thank you. Renier.
But yeah, I extend that O too from German.
So,
But anyway,
Renier?
Yeah. Renier.
Okay, I'll go with that.
Well, Sean, when he brought that question up as to whether the encyclopedia was one of those things, the second encyclopedia that was a Renier, so that got my mind spinning. And at the end of the book, when you have the appearance of the compass and the super ultra heavy cone, so are those Renier? And then you begin to wonder, is the whole encyclopedia a Renier? And so
is this a Renier?
Yeah. So then you begin to wonder, is the idea, the world of Tlön actually exactly this world, just under a different frame of interpretation? Right. So anyway.
And I do think, so a thing that kind of struck me, and we're kind of out of time, but when I was reading it, is that the ideology that the people in the world of Tlön have is also an ideology that like ushers in its own existence, if that makes, like, those two things are compatible. It's not like the people of Tlön believe in something that would exclude the possibility of their existence. And I don't know how helpful that point is, but I found it kind of interesting, right? Like that the people of Tlön would say it makes sense that they would come into existence because people thought that they existed.
Yeah.
Right? It wouldn't be surprising to them.
Yeah.
Well, this is like the whole conversation we've been having. I'm a political scientist by training, so that's a lot of my examples, but I've read a lot of history. And I was thinking, maybe Nazism did not need to be created, invented, developed, but once Nazism exists, it seems like we can't forget the tenets of Nazism. And I'm like, gosh, it would be great if this were 1914 and we somehow could jump intellectually so that Nazism as a body of thought didn't exist. And I know that's a stupid thing to say, but it's how do you unlearn or unknow this pernicious ideology? Because it now in America, it seems to be showing up. And may I apologize, I don't want to dominate, but there was one other thing. Did you hear, I never heard of this organization, a U.S. Senate candidate in Oregon won the Republican primary. She's part of a group called, I think it's QAnon or QAnon.
QAnon, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
And
Yeah.
this is the group that
Yeah.
says that major Democrats are part of a cannibalistic child sex ring that was operating out of a basement of a pizzeria in Washington, D.C., which doesn't have a basement. But a couple years ago, a man who was convinced of this got some guns, went to the pizzeria, and thank God no one was killed. But now he's sitting in jail. But I'm thinking to myself, this is the dark side of Tlön. This is the dark side of a completely self-contained world of ideas where people could honestly, rational people think, yeah, there's a bunch of pedophiling cannibals that somehow are extraordinarily important, operating in broad daylight in Washington, D.C.
Or, you know, think about the creation of things like the creation of the nuclear bomb. We can't
Yes.
uncreate that.
Right.
And that's going to be with us for probably forever. And
Yeah.
I mean, that's sort of, I don't know, if you think of anything, and maybe this is too extreme, but if, you know, if you have an idea and you can bring that idea into reality, in some sense, that's a Renier in a way. You have the conception of this massively destructive object. Once it's in the world, it's there forever.
You know, I think one thing is, so we can think of these as like, you know, very particular ideologies like Nazism, you know, the whole Pizzagate thing, that's very particular, but you can also kind of see that there's sort of like structural, not universals, but basically like a kind of a common structure between some of these ways of thinking, and that, you know, a lot of ways that people, you know, create a belief system is through these kind of like binary distinctions of things. You know, there's like a self, like a us, a we, a community, and then an other that's excluded from that. And, you know, a lot of times societies, they, in order to create their identity, they have to create also simultaneously this concept of the excluded other, which then usually gets blamed for things, scapegoated, and then all these negative qualities that whatever the site considers negative usually get projected onto that scapegoat. So you see a lot of the same things with Nazism. And one thing I think is interesting, I don't want to go into a whole bunch of this, especially because it's already past 4, but so with the Pizzagate thing that I was just talking about, a lot of the basically idea that, you know, these elite people eat people and drink their blood and do sacrifice to the devil, that's been accused against people for about 2,000 years.
Right.
Going back to basically before Orthodox Christianity was even really a thing against the Gnostics. Actually, they were the group who eventually became Orthodox Christianity were accusing the Gnostics of the same thing.
Proto-Orthodox.
You go to the witch hunting period, same thing, meeting with the devil, eating babies, drinking blood, blood libel, the same thing, accusing Jewish communities of the same thing, of drinking babies' blood, devil worship, same thing. This is the same thing, and this is also part of the satanic panic in the 80s.
Right.
This is an extension of that. And I get friends that are liberal and not Christian that send me video links saying that this Pizzagate thing is real, even after they show that the place doesn't even have a basement and all this stuff. And yeah, I don't know. This is a good example of basically these negative hyperstitions coming in. Like, let's just be more intelligent about the things, the fictions that we create that kind of bleed into reality in a sense, and stop using these same tropes of like these people are eating babies. Like, come on, please, people. I mean, I'll eat a baby. I don't care, but you know.
Well, what's really disturbing is from what I've read in anthropological literature, and so this is pre-Christian, is the number of cultures that's their first go-to to criticize or to stigmatize other tribes or clans. Oh yeah, they eat people. That's so when anthropologists went into some areas over 100 years ago, it was like, oh, well, what about those other people? It's like, oh, well, you don't want to go near them because they eat people. And I just think that's almost like the text. And in fact, that's, if you notice Uqbar, take the first and last letter, which was, maybe the first city in Western culture in Mesopotamia. But it's interesting and sad that you would think after how many thousands of years of human intellectual societal development that we're going back to things that appear to be dominant as an insult, as a claim, as a libel, as a charge in pre-literate cultures. And yet we're here in 2020 and that's still being used as, they do that.
Yeah, exactly. It seems like our age has lost a lot of historical sense. And I think that's a lot of what Borges is trying to get at, is like our history is going to be erased, and we're not going to, and that's what it feels like. It feels like, we have like this vertigo where we have no bearings anymore.
Right.
And there's just like the immediacy of this moment, the sensation of this procession of images constantly bearing down on us, and we can't get we can't synthesize a temporal continuity of any kind to get a sense of a past that's continuing into the present that will have a future. It seems as a society, it's like we've lost any kind of sense of time, of real time. And yeah, I see the same thing. It's just kind of like aesthetically disappointing that a lot of these things are so dominant. And yeah,
we can't come up with a better insult, or at least newer insult, a more creative insult.
A friend of mine says we're pretty much the same as we always have been, except less hairy. That's true.
Is that also true? Especially true for you and me?
Yeah, especially for us, yeah. Yep.
I mean, I was just, oh man, the hipsters though, they're bringing back the hair. I don't even know if that's true anymore.
Well,
so that
go ahead.
The YouTube link I just sent is a clip of Deleuze talking. So it's from a talk he has about cinema. It's really good. But in there, he's talking about one director's idea about dreams. And he says basically, if you get caught in another person's dream because you don't dream yourself, you're fucked. Basically, or they translate it there as like you're in trouble or something. But I've heard it translated as you're fucked, which I like better.
Yeah, well, that's a good Anglo-Saxon.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think he makes a really good point that corresponds with this, and that, this is the danger of not dreaming ourselves, is that you get caught up in the other person's dream. And he says, I wrote it down here, yeah. People's dreams are always devouring and threaten to engulf us. Dreams have a terrible will to power, and each of us is a victim to the other's dream. Beware of the other's dream, because if you're caught in the other's dream, you're fucked. I think you got to listen to it, because Deleuze's voice is perfect for it. He smoked a lot, had like lung problems. He has this really rough voice, and he's like a horror story narrator. It's brilliant.
Or else he's tough weights.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thanks, guys. It was fun and enlightening. See you, some of you Friday, others in a week.